morning, Tri-Cities. It's 9 o'clock on Friday, so it's time for Coffee with Karl. After a hiatus that we took earlier this year, we're excited to be back. I'm Karl from TRIDEC, and we have a very special guest today, our own lobbyist for TRIDEC that has been, I think, Tim, you told me that TRIDEC was your first client when you first started, maybe back in the 80s with K&L Gates. Tim Peckinpaugh is a partner at K&L Gates. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Karl. That's right. My very first client was TRIDEC, and so I'm very, very partial to my first client.
We appreciate that. And we'll just assume first and best, right?
Absolutely, all the way through.
Okay. And of course, the other part of our federal programs team, David Replog, our Vice President of Federal Programs. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Okay, well, let's see if I can remember how to do this. It has been a while. We're excited to be back. Like we said, we start off with talking about coffee stories, or coffee mugs. And so I've got one that the TRIDEC team put together for me, and it's actually got our Coffee with Karl logo on it. And of course, the TRIDEC shared logo, Tri-Cities logo, which is an awesome mug. And I just want to say that we've been so busy this year with kind of coming back after the COVID shutdown. Coffee with Karl, we kind of put it on hiatus, but we're looking forward to a couple more webinars before the end of the year, and then bringing it back on a regular schedule next year. And we always appreciate all the community support wherever we go. People always give us a plug and say, hey, I like Coffee with Karl, and so we're excited to be back. So that's my mug. Tim, what do you have for us?
Well, I have a mug about the U.S. Army, and this is from my son, actually, who loves the Army, and he was actually interning for the Army Museum being built in Virginia at our prior home, and got the mug for him for his service as a curator for some of the items for the museum. It's been his ambition his entire life to serve in the U.S. Army, but there are some medical issues that have not allowed to happen. But he now works for the U.S. Army Corps, actually in Clarkston, now in Washington State, so he has a connection again. And so in honor of my son, I have his coffee mug for the U.S. Army. And I would also say we're now 1 week old, but still, for all the veterans out there, appreciate your service, and we really understand the value you've made to keep this country free.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Tim. And I did want to point out that you have rejoined your Eastern Washington roots, right? Now are residing at your mountain chalet in Cle Elum. And so it's good to have you back in the state.
Yes, it is the better Washington. We've been here for about over a month now, living in Cle Elum in the mountains, looking right now at the Stewart Range. It's beautifully snow-capped, gorgeous morning, but it's cold out there. It's 17 degrees right now. Yeah, we have to deal with the cold weather as well. But all things considered, we're very happy by being back in the better Washington. That's
great. Well, it's good to have you back. David, how about you? What do you have for a mug or a mug story for us this morning?
Yeah, since the topic of today's Coffee with Karl is the federal election update, I brought, I don't know if it shows up too well, but it's a United States Senate mug. There it is. As a lot of folks might know, I spent 12 years working as a Senate staffer, and I think the mug might be one of the few things I have to show for it. But I did pick it up somewhere along the way, and so I thought it was an appropriate mug for today's conversation.
Thanks, David. I appreciate your humor, but I just have to say, like, I think your especially your Senate experience working for Senator Cantwell and Senator Murray before is invaluable to all of us in the Tri-Cities. You do a great job representing all of us, and just understanding, along with, obviously everything that Tim brings to the table. You guys are a pretty killer team for us as far as, working effectively within the federal programs, and federal spending has such a huge impact on the Tri-Cities. So, you got a lot out of that Senate experience, and you really do a great job for us. So thanks.
All right, well, thanks.
Yeah, no. So today we're looking forward, as Tim always does for us and has in the past, kind of an update on the midterm elections that we just got through with, along with Veterans Day. And so, Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you've been nice enough to put a few slides together for us on kind of the election results, and then we'll get into some questions. I see we already have one question down below, but if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to put any questions in the question and answer box down below. If you're on social media, you can ask a question in the comment section, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions today. So let's fire up the presentation and take it away, Tim.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, as Carl said, we had an election. I know a lot of voters probably very tired of all the negative ads, but that's behind us for now, and we'll get gear up for 24 here pretty soon. But for now, so let's do a recap of the midterms just finished up for 22. So let me just summarize the results, and I'll have some analysis as and the impact upon the region as well. Next slide. So for the U.S. Senate, it came down to Pennsylvania. That was the one change. Nothing else changed in the Senate. All the Republican states stayed Republican, and these states stayed Democratic. But Pennsylvania did flip, and therefore the Democrats now have a +1 advantage in the Senate. The Georgia runoff, you'll see gray there on the map, is not until December 6th, but it doesn't really matter at this point because the Senate's already flipped Democrat fully, but they now have a majority with 50. It'd be 51 if they get Georgia as well. That seat in Georgia is meaningful though, because if they get 51, then they get one more Democrat per committee. That way they avoid tie votes in committee. And then of course they also get more committee staff as a result. So certainly in the inside game, the extra seat is meaningful, but as a practical matter, the Democrats have one control of the Senate with or without the Georgia runoff. I might add that Pennsylvania was interesting, as was Arizona, New Hampshire, Georgia, of course, and Nevada were the swing states. And in all four of those, there were Trump endorsed candidates who were running that were very relevant to the outcome. Quite frankly, I'll discuss that more later on. Next slide. In the House, we just announced 2 days ago that there was a flip in the House. It took a while for the Republicans to get to 218 when they got there. And it's a very small margin, just an 8-seat change thus far. When it's all said and done, probably about 221, maybe 222 for the Republicans in the House. There's still 4 or 5 seats in California uncalled, 1 in Colorado, and the Alaska seat are yet to be called. But when they're all called, we're guessing about 221, 222 for the Republicans in the House. And that's about the same ratio we have for Democrats right now in the House. So it's just simply a flip over and about an 8-seat pickup overall. You might see the top of that page as well. There is the raw vote total. And surprisingly, the Republicans are over 3 million votes ahead. And I'll discuss later on. So to me, that's still a kind of a quirky statistic, but that's where things stand based upon the vote total for the House. And of course, the House will now flip to Republicans given these results. Next slide. Now, close to home here in Washington State, this map shows the results in the Senate race between Patty Murray and Tiffany Smiley. Again, the map underscores the state's very strong west-east side split. Republican counties, of course, are in red. King County drives the state. That is where the big vote total occurs and where the Democrats do so well in statewide races. I might add that even on election day, I got lots of emails and texts and phone calls from my colleagues back out east saying, is it really true that Patty could lose? I mean, it was amazing that narrative was out there. I questioned it. I thought the race would be closer than it was, but still, I couldn't find a way that Patty could lose the race, and she won by 15 points. So really a fantastic win for her. And then one more click on the clicker if you could, and you'll see that. And locally, even though statewide, Patty is winning big. In Benton County, of course, Tiffany does well. And also in Franklin County, one more click, she even does better. So again, underscores the east-west split, the rural-urban split in Washington State, with Tiffany doing very, very well in the rural counties, eastern counties, and Patty doing very well in the more urbanized western portion of the state. Next slide. So the House races in Washington State. Interesting here as well. Again, you see the red, blue, east and west split in the state, plus the dark blue is a pickup. That's actually a new Democratic seat in Washington State. And so now we only have 2 Republicans left in the entire delegation, that's Stan Newhouse and Kathy McMorris Rogers in districts 4 and 5, the two eastern districts of Washington State. And let's just look at District 4, first of all, one more click. So here home for Dan Newhouse had no problem. I saw Newhouse's staff election day. They thought that 60% would be a pretty good result. He got 66, 67%. So did very, very well in his reelection. No drama here at all, quite frankly. So he's been reelected. And then now one more click in District 3. This was a huge surprise. Again, Herrera Butler, Jamie, the incumbent, got beat by Joe Kent in the primary. Joe Kent's in a Trump-endorsed candidate. And we all thought he was going to win, quite frankly, based upon the raw numbers in the primary. It was 2-1 Republican. And therefore, the data was showing that he would be a likely winner. In fact, even the 538 website, which leans somewhat left, they felt there was a 2% chance that Kent could lose this race. Well, he lost. 1 percentage point loss. And Maria Glubenskamp Perez is the new member from District 3. First-time candidate, interesting story for her. I would add that her campaign has said, elect a normal person to Congress. And that normalcy paid off, quite frankly, and having her elected now to serve in the Congress. I'll talk more about what her race might mean. This is perhaps the biggest single upset nationwide on the House side, quite frankly. And then in District 8, one more click, Kim Schreier was reelected. This was supposed to be a very competitive race. I thought it would be a nail biter, quite frankly, but it's a 6-point win for her in this race. And so all the incumbents in Washington State won. Of course, Herrera Butler lost the primary, but those incumbents who survived the primary did have no problem getting through and being reelected. So that's the delegation right now. I think District 3 will still be swing and maybe 8 as well, but given Kim's performance, I think 8 now probably is becoming less and less a target for Republicans because they cannot take her out during a pretty good year for Republicans overall. So that's the delegation for the Congress. Next slide. So what does this all mean? This is a very interesting election. I mean, we always say that, but this one in particular I find very intriguing. And to me, it's my first talking point here. This is a very unhappy electorate, and yet they voted for almost no change. If you look at the numbers right now, the wrong track, right track is like off the charts, like 65% margin. Biden's numbers are in the low 40s. The high inflation, high gas prices, just general discontent by voters, and yet they voted for almost no change, which is very odd to me. You would think in that kind of climate, they would do a throw out the bums kind of approach or make some statement about they want to have a change. But despite being unhappy, there's only 1 change in the Senate and 8 in the House. Second bullet here is that the Republican issue advantages did not really pan out for them. They clearly were winning on issues like inflation, economic issues, the border, crime. They had those issues in their hip pocket. They were doing very well on those issues. They actually were the big issues for most voters, except abortion was a big player as well for the Democrats. And that in combination with Trump fears, I think tempered the Republican advantage. They should have done much better based upon the atmospherics, the environment out there politically. But I think the abortion issue, the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, energized the Democratic base, and particularly women voters. And also just this fear that we're tired of Trump. And I think a lot of voters want to kind of send a message that they want to have candidates that weren't like Trump. And it's not just so much Trump's policies, it's just Trump's style, I think, that voters are turned off by. As we saw in District 3, for example, in Washington State, where, again, a simple message on normalcy is going to carry the day. And if you're perceived as being radicalized and way out there, election denier, for example, I think that hurts you for many voters, particularly in the middle. The next bullet is that the high Republican vote turnout didn't really produce a wave, and it should have, quite frankly. I mean, I was impressed and still impressed that the Republicans got 3 million more votes nationwide on the House races than Democrats. Historically, that should produce a wave. It did not do so, though. And again, it's because I think the voters looking for normal candidates, the abortion issue cutting away, I think, of the Republican advantage on key issues. But it's still quite a mystery to me as to why that didn't happen. I think part of it is that, ironically now, Republican voters are losing the advantage of districts because they're They're winning too big in certain areas, like in rural areas, for example. That was an issue for Democrats for years, where they were getting huge majorities in urban areas, but it's not producing more new seats because it was just a concentrating vote in the same areas where they're already winning. I think Republicans now have that issue. Another issue is that the minority vote, the Hispanic voter and even some African-American voters were voting a bit more Republican this time, and that cut away some of the Democratic margins, but it didn't really change the district lines very much. So we're still digging into that. To me, it's quite a conundrum about a fairly significant vote for Republican in terms of raw vote total, but it didn't really translate too much into congressional district wins. And big part of that is that candidates do matter, particularly in the U.S. Senate this time. And McConnell kept saying this, that we have to put up good candidates to win these seats. But in the swing areas, New Hampshire, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, states that were winnable for the Republicans, they put up not the best candidate, quite frankly. And so I think that was a big factor in why the results were not more Republican, given the good environment for Republicans this time, is that candidates that were put up were not the best candidates. They were all Trump-endorsed candidates, I might add. I think the voters, by and large, were not very happy with that result. They prefer to have candidates that they perceived as being somewhat different. Independents also broke narrowly for Democrats. Again, odd, because it's all the issues, with the exception of abortion, were very much trending Republican. So unclear, but still they got a 2% advantage point for Democrats, and that was also a factor that tempered Republican wins nationwide. And then interesting, the incumbents won. Again, odd result given the public's discontent, but in the Senate, every incumbent won that stood for election. In the House, over 97% of the incumbents won. So again, odd result, but incumbency still is advantageous. And despite the fact the public seems to want to have a change, they still keep electing their members of Congress. Next slide. So what are the implications for the Tri-Cities? Our delegation is more powerful than ever. I mean, our senior colleague in our firm discussed this on Monday with our team, that and he used to work for Warren Magnuson way back in the day. I mean, Patty Murray is in the chair of the Appropriations Committee. That is a big deal for our state. She is now Senate Pro Tem, third in succession to the presidency. That is a big deal for the state, giving her enormous power and influence in the process. Maria Cantwell is going to chair the Commerce Committee. Again, a committee very relevant to our state. Fisheries, information technology, data issues, commerce issues, technology issues, science, all those part of that committee's jurisdiction. So again, very helpful to have someone of her stature chairing that committee. On the Republican side, we have McMorris Rogers, Kathy in the neighboring district in Spokane, District 5. She will now chair the Energy and Commerce Committee, and that's a very powerful committee. That's a huge win for Washington State, very helpful on the hydroelectric energy issues, dam issues, plus on nuclear. That committee has that jurisdiction for nuclear and for hydro, among many other things. So that's all very good for us. Plus we have Adam Smith from the West Side, Tacoma area, South Seattle area. He will remain as the ranking Democrat on Armed Services. And we also have Rick Larson, who was well positioned to be the ranking member on the Transportation Committee on Infrastructure. So again, delegation really is steeped in players well positioned, very influential. We should be very happy about having a delegation that's so well positioned to help our interests here in the Tri-Cities. Now, can they do much though? Probably not. I don't see much chance for sweeping legislation. These big reconciliation bills that Congress just got done with, I don't see them happening anytime soon. Of course, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, we had CHIPS plus Science Act, we had the infrastructure bill. Those big bills were consequential, game-changing bills. And they got done because you had Democrats in the House and Senate, plus a Democrat in the White House who can sign those bills. I don't see it happening in the next 2 years because you have divided government. House is divided from the Senate, and plus you have the presidency won't sign Republican bills. And so I don't see a chance for any kind of sweeping reconciliation style legislation. They'll pass appropriations bills, they'll do the defense bill every year, but I don't see significant change. There'll be efforts tried, but they will probably not succeed. Instead, you will have Congress focus a lot on investigations. They'll do oversight. There's pent-up demand for Republicans in the House in particular to investigate and to look for inefficiencies in government, look for scandals, just look for wrongs, if you will. And so I would expect a lot of focus on the investigations oversight function of the Congress. Likewise, I think the executive branch will do more because Biden's team will know they really can't legislate. And so they will flip and focus more on regulation. You recall Obama said he has a pen and a phone, and that's true as well for Biden. He can issue executive orders, he can do regulations, he has executive powers to him that he can take advantage of to advance his agenda. Likewise, there'll be a big focus on implementing the big bills. I mean, our focus for our clients right now in DC, quite frankly, is trying to figure out where the money's going to go on infrastructure, on chips, for example, on hydrogen hubs. A whole variety of programs are being funded right now. And the issue is, can you get yourself positioned to qualify for those funds and just track the money? There's billions flowing through the system right now. And that's a big part of the effort is how you execute the spending that's already been approved by Congress in these big bills from the previous Congress. And then finally, there is a glimmer of a hope for bipartisan opportunities. I don't see many of them, but there could be a few that could occur. And I think part of the irony here is that in the House, it's a very slim majority. And incoming likely Speaker Kevin McCarthy has a very small margin to work with. But because of that, he might be successful in convincing his caucus, which has a lot of division, that, hey guys, we have to work as a team here. If 3 or 4 of you were to bolt and not support us, then we'll lose the majority. And so that might actually be helpful to him to convince them to focus on a team approach and look for bipartisanship with Democratic colleagues and attempt to find areas of common ground. Now, maybe I'm being sophomoric in saying that, but I'm just hopeful that could be a few areas where that could occur. I'm happy to discuss in more detail during Q&A, perhaps what those might be. Closing comment on leadership. This has been a very momentous week in the Congress on leadership changes. Of course, yesterday, Pelosi announced that she's stepping down as the Democratic leader, as is Hoyer, who's been number 2, and then Clyburn, number 3, is going to also pull back a little bit. And that will now usher in a new generation of Democrats. Hakeem Jeffries will become the new Democratic leader and presumed speaker at one point. And there's also Clark of Massachusetts, and there's Aguilar of California. Those are the 3 new leaders with Democrats in the House. And all 3, by the way, are in their early 50s. So they're more than 30 years younger than the current leadership in the Democratic House. So it really is a generational change that's occurring. On the Republican side, Kevin McCarthy is the likely incoming speaker. Now he needs to get the votes in January. He has the support right now of his caucus, but he needs to have 218 when they vote in January. And so there'll be a few in the Freedom Caucus that may leverage him, and that may cause some drama in January. But Kevin has earned to be speaker. He waited 7 years for this. He was there before, but was pulled back. There's a Freedom Caucus opposition. I think he'll find a way to get to 218 come January. On the Senate side, it's the same leadership team. Schumer will, of course, be there for the Democrats, and then McConnell, despite some dissension, had no problem getting the votes to become or stay as a Republican leader in the Senate. So with that, I will stand down and love to have your questions.
Thanks, Tim. As always, that was a really, really good overview. We'll start off with some questions from the audience. And so we had a couple from our friend, C. Mark Smith, noted local author, historian, and economic development leader. First of all, he gave Tracy Zhao, who actually created Coffee with Karl. I have to give Tracy kudos too. She created Coffee with Karl. This is all her idea, and she does all the work for us. All we have to do is sit around and drink coffee. She does a wonderful job. Mark was complimenting Tracy on the slides. But his other question is Mark's wondering if voter discontent might lead some moderate members on both sides to cooperate on passing things they can agree on. And I think that's more the House, but then, depending upon what the issue is, maybe the Senate would come along as well. You think there's an answer or a potential for that, Tim?
Yeah, I think so. And Mark, I'm glad you're on the call. I've read all your books. Appreciate them very much. I'm curious to know what your next conference is going to be. So yeah, moderates are very influential. They always have been. Interesting enough, for the Republicans, a big part of their new majority is based upon winning 4 seats in New York, and they're mostly moderate Republicans who won. That's kind of strange. And they have power, and they might actually be a balance of the Freedom Caucus. That's the hard right portion, the Republican caucus in the House. That actually could be very helpful. Underscores McCarthy's challenge, though, to keep the moderates and the hard right conservatives happy. And that's the challenge that Pelosi had too, quite frankly, in her caucus. And was very successful, by the way, in managing it. That's why she, I think, will go down as a historic speaker, is that she was very effective in getting things done. Yeah, so there's a chance. There's a chance, I think, that the moderates could step up, and they might provide an opportunity to find common ground to kind of drive the policymaking back to the center. The reality is that any kind of enduring legislation that has staying power has to have some bipartisan support. We've had this problem now the past several Congresses of lurching to the far right, lurching back to the far left, and back and forth. And you end up with these big bills that then get challenged, and the reconciliation process the next time is simply trying to do away with the earlier reconciliation process of the bad bill that was passed before. So that's not a very healthy way to have governing, in my opinion. It'd be nice to find a way to get back to legislating, producing bills that have some modicum of bipartisanship, and therefore they have public support nationwide, and therefore they can survive and not just be constantly challenged in courts or by the next Congress who wants to do away with them. So Mark, I like your point. I hope you're right. Like I said, there's a glimmer of bipartisanship we could see on areas of common ground. And ironically, the close division in the House may create that opportunity. However, I'm still tepid and still a little concerned that we may still have divided government, which reflects the public, by the way. The public's divided as well. And Republicans might spend more time doing investigations, the I gotchas, if you will, as opposed to legislating. I hope that I'm wrong in that regard, but I'm concerned that perhaps they'll start that way, and we'll hope they'll move back to the center as they gear up for 24. I just don't know.
David, do you have any questions for Tim? I've got a whole list of questions here, but I'll give you the floor first.
Yeah, one quick follow-up to what you were just saying, Tim. It seems like it's easier for both parties whenever they're in power in both chambers of Congress as well as in the White House to do things like pass annual budgets without too much kind of partisan bickering or passing debt ceiling expansions or extensions. Do you expect that there might be more of that sort of partisan bickering that might create either federal government shutdowns or more challenges with the debt ceiling as we look at the next couple of years?
Yeah, I do actually, and that certainly is the issue that cause a lot of divisiveness. In fact, the Democrats right now want to put debt ceiling in play and do it before they leave power. Republicans have said no thus far, but I could see a case for Democrats to say, let's just do reconciliation right now, one last chance, and then pass a debt ceiling in the process of doing so, get the issue off the table and avoid economic uncertainty next year. I like that in terms of a policy proposition, but it didn't quite fit the current partisan paradigm. Republicans have said already no to that suggestion. They want to have the gavel to make decisions next year. The problem is the debt ceiling is a tough issue. It's tough to vote for it, quite frankly. And if you have uncertainty because you don't pass it, then the financial markets are very, very unhappy. And you have a chance for a financial meltdown. We had this a few years ago. In fact, they had to downgrade U.S. credit as a result, which is not good for the overall economy because of the uncertainty created by not being able to show we can extend the debt ceiling and just make good on our prior debts. So that is a tough issue, and one that's ripe for leverage and partisanship next year, which is why I think some Republicans are unprepared to say, yes, let's do it now. They want to do it next year, and they feel they can use it as a hammer to get stuff they want to have happen. So tough issue. I'm hopeful they can find a way. I think September, October is the current thinking when the debt ceiling has to be extended or lifted. So we have some time here, but the more time it goes on, the more leverage is built, and you may have a lot of drama occurring in the September timeframe of next year, particularly with appropriations bills and the annual defense authorization bill, all the must-do bills also coming due in September, October. That in combination with debt ceiling, could create one of the so-called fiscal cliff time periods that is often one that results in not good legislation and a lot of anxiety in the economy.
To maybe a follow-up question on that one. I know in past discussions you've talked to us. I think even going back to some of the COVID relief bills, we talked about quite a bit of spending, and obviously that money went out in our economy, and we all know that there was probably some bearing that it had on inflation because all of a sudden everybody had a lot of money to spend. But our conversation was around debt and the U.S. debt, and obviously, I mean, going back to Ross Perot, right? Like that was his thing back in the day about we got to take care of this debt or it's going to own us. And there's this what's his name, Keynesian economic philosophy, right? That just says government spending doesn't matter. Just keep on pumping the money into the system. But you brought up the counter to that, which I think is what Republicans now started to talk about, assuming they were going to get the red wave. They were starting to talk about entitlements. And your point is that government debt doesn't really matter when the interest rate is zero. But now when the interest rate is rising to try to curb inflation, it does have a bearing. I think that's where Republicans are starting to bring this up. And I wonder if that, starting to work on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security might be some of the things that they try to trade out in future, assuming that the debt ceiling isn't lifted. You think that's something like that might play out, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, that is the grand bargain that perhaps could come. I don't know if we're quite ready for it, but that's a good description of what has to happen at some point. Entitlements are this issue that all parties know are there and they have to be dealt with, but no one has the guts to do it, quite frankly. Republicans have tried a couple of times, and then they get clobbered politically for even thinking about it. So it's a very, very difficult situation. Republicans will want to try to cut spending next year. And so I want to just let folks know, no surprises here, I suspect, but obviously the leadership is going to tell the appropriators who will now have the gavel for the Republicans in the House, have to cut spending. So they want to get that message out there. They want to make the point that the overspending from their standpoint the past 2 years was a cause for inflation. American Rescue Plan in particular, 1.9 billion, that was on top of other billions that were already in the economy. And that got the economy pumped up too much, and that was a cause for inflation. So the response is we have to spend less. So that message is out there, and they have to deliver on that message, and part of it is to cut spending. The reality is that spending is not the real problem. It's less than a third of our federal budget. The 2/3 are the entitlement programs. So it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and no one wants to cut them. And no one says you should cut them, but efforts to rein in the growth of those programs, I think, is worth a discussion. Trying to perhaps modernize the eligibility requirements, not immediately, but over time, would be, again, a topic for discussion. And just the interest rate too. I mean, we will soon have a situation where 3/4 of our federal budget is going to be Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and interest. And you're right, interest is now relevant. And we had low interest rates for a long time. Now we have high interest rates, and that only magnifies the problem. As we borrow more money, we have to pay more and more to pay it back. I saw a report this past week that we'll be at a $40 trillion national debt here pretty soon. And at some point, that begins to exceed the value of our economy. So it's a concern. And no one wants to talk about it, quite frankly. All politicians want to shy away from the issue. And since they don't talk about entitlements, they end up doing more spending cuts, which is also the best answer to some extent. And also this causes lots of angst in the system. So therein lies the issue, as to how you need to have some courage to make these tough decisions. And the voter can help, quite frankly. I mean, when voters get this message, oh, they're trying to cut Social Security, you need to kind of push back on that. No one's saying we should cut Social Security. It's only a question about down the road, can we get this program under control so that we can not have Social Security eat away at the entire US economy by trying to, again, reform the eligibility factors, not make immediate cuts. And even saying it this way may not sound like it's, I tried to argue politically, but we have to find a way to get a narrative that allows the public to understand that this is the source of the problem, and we have to find a way to get some controls around it. Otherwise, I don't see, it's not sustainable long term, and it needs to be dealt with. And the longer we don't deal with it, the longer the problem festers and becomes even a more difficult problem 5-10 years away from now.
You bet. Thanks. That was a great explanation on a really complex issue. I think that's kind of what we face. Not that it's anything new. I think we've always faced it, but you know, these are complex issues that it's hard to message or communicate that to the general public in general, right? I think, I mean, maybe, and I think it was part of the the framers of the Constitution. That was a debate that they had back then, right? A representative republic versus a true democracy. And so I think we still are in that situation. We're seeing it play out in elections today. Let's go to some of our audience questions. Gary Spanner had a question that said, I read recently that Republicans in the House may institute a rule that only legislation favored by a majority of Republicans will reach the floor for a vote. Do you think this will happen? And if so, what are the implications?
I think it will happen. It has been the practice. This is the Hassett rule that was in place when he was speaker. And that was a majority of the majority needs to say yay verily, otherwise it ain't gonna come up on the House floor as long as Republicans are in power. So that was the philosophy. It kind of got pulled back a little bit. I think they'll probably come back in, quite frankly. I think that McCarthy, to keep the Freedom Caucus folks on his team, will have to say, yeah, you know, we're gonna only put stuff up that we think reflects the majority of our own party as fair issues. So yeah, I think it's going to come back. Will it be formalized as actually a rule? I don't know. I think as a matter of practice, yeah, it's going to come back as what they'll probably have to do to maintain control of their fractious caucus for Republicans, is to tell them, yeah, we're not going to bring stuff up on the floor that the majority of you all in the Republican conference support. Only those you support will come up. And that itself is going to be a factor on can you get bipartisanship? If you start off with a notion that we're going to only bring up stuff that we support, then that itself, may be a damper on looking for common ground on bipartisanship. It may not be, because you might have some issues that the majority of Republicans can support that some Democrats can support. Appropriations is an example of that, for example, and maybe other federal programs that I think have common ground. So yeah, it's possible, but yeah, the answer is yes, it's going to come back.
Thank you. Mark had another question that you mentioned that McConnell had no problem keeping his leader position, but isn't it significant that he only got 1 out of every 5 in his caucus to vote for him?
That's still pretty good. I think he got, I think it was like 37-10 was the vote that occurred. That's I think he has control of his caucus. I mean, McConnell's an interesting guy. I mean, the guy is a curmudgeon and not a good communicator, and he's not well liked. In fact, of all the popularity polling, he's below even Pelosi, I think. And he's has horrible numbers with the general public. Let me tell you, this guy is a good senator who plays a great inside game. He's very cagey, incredibly focused on winning, if you will, where it counts most, which is the inside game for him. I mean, there was this big split. Rick Scott, who chairs the campaign committee, and he had a split. Scott was saying we had to put forward an agenda on some issues to help our candidates. And McConnell was saying, no, let's just give me good candidates and we have good atmospherics, we're going to win. And to McConnell's credit, I think he's right. I mean, the candidates that were in play for Arizona, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Georgia, we don't have a Georgia result yet, but the candidate probably underperformed, are, I think, instructive, because that's McConnell's point. Give us good candidates that are competent, experienced, present well, are not just hard right bomb throwers. Those are not, they have to understand the integrity of elections. They simply can't say elections are stolen. And those endorsed by Trump, I think, didn't do well. And so I think McConnell was right. And that was sort of his response to Rick Scott, who challenged him for leadership. And I think McConnell did fine. I mean, for a guy who's got horrific popularity numbers, to get 4/5 or thereabouts of his own Republican members, I think is still a pretty good sign that he's a player and he is going to be very influential in DC for this next upcoming Congress. I believe in January, when he is again ratified as the Republican leader, he'll set the record for the most consecutive years in the Senate of a party leader, I think breaking Mansfield's record from Montana.
Oh, that's good insight. And I think that, again, speaks about kind of the split in between, popular election rhetoric, if you will, or just, kind of man on the street layperson view. And then the people that are in the Senate, I mean, to his caucus, to your point, they know that he's been very effective. I mean, look what he did in blocking the Supreme Court vote at the end of Obama's term, that led to the conservative majority that led to overturning Roe v. Wade. So, I mean, like within his caucus, they know like, well, yeah, maybe we don't like him, but geez, the guy's winning for us. And winning in their cases, it's, even like I think the way the direction that they went during Obama's term, for instance, was one of, that kind of like set the stage for a Trump victory in a lot of ways, right? Because it was sort of like it created this rhetorical thing. So it's very, very interesting for sure. David, do you have a question for us? And then we'll get into this last one from the audience and then maybe talk about some of the future programs coming up.
Yeah, I think I just say one thing to McConnell.
Yeah.
He always made the point when he was always questioned by reporters who were trying to get him to talk about his lack of popularity. He said, what I care about, I care about voters in Kentucky. They reelect me, and I care about my Republican senators. That's what I care about. Yeah. That's my audience. That's my electorate. As long as they elect me in Kentucky, Republican senators like what I do and what I deliver for them, then I'll stay leader. And he's right. He understands, what he has to do and say and what his audience is and who he has to please to stay in power.
You bet. That's a great point.
And Tim, I was going to ask too. So we all know that the year of an election year is always a bit of a crazy year, midterm to some degree, but especially presidential election years. And looking forward, we saw that President Trump just announced that he's running for election again. And usually you start getting the presidential announcements maybe halfway through the year before the election, but he announced pretty early that he's running. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how his announcement is going to shape the debate or the actions of Congress in the next couple of years.
Well, that is the big question. Yes, it's influential. There's no question. He still has a significant base in the Republican Party. And so, yeah, his announcement early on is going to be huge. It's the influence in the agenda for the Congress and also just presidential politics. And it may change Biden's calculation, quite frankly, what he wants to do. One of my colleagues this morning, in fact, who I respect, the Democrat, predicted that Biden will not run, that he'll just retire and allow a new generation to come in, kind of following Pelosi's lead of Democrats to claim the mantle to run against Trump. Now, I don't know if that changes because of Trump's already being in. Biden can beat Trump, probably. Could Biden beat a younger, more vigorous, more center-based Republican? Probably not, I think. So that may be a factor in Biden's decision-making, that he could be reelected and he may feel an obligation to take down Trump again a second time. So yeah, I think it's huge in determining all kinds of dominoes that have to fall between now and 24 in terms of candidates on both sides, timing, the issues in Congress. It's again McCarthy. Paul McCarthy has got like 3 or 4 seat majority, he's got some Freedom Caucus members who obviously will follow Trump's lead, and Trump tells them you have to, say no to this, then that's going to put McCarthy in a box. And so it'll drive what McCarthy can do politically. Now, he might have to be careful and not put forward certain issues, even though they might have great support and excellent things in the country, for fear that if Trump were to say no, then he would be caught and couldn't get the votes to have it passed. So yeah, it's no question. It dictates much of the agenda for the upcoming Congress plus 24 on both sides, Democrat, Republican, the candidates, timetable. Yeah, there's no question. It's hugely influential in driving the country. Now, the results of the election, I think, suggest that Trump's sway of the party is diminishing somewhat. And so perhaps that would be a factor. And you might see more Republicans prepared to break with him. We'll see. I mean, interesting guy. This is probably his lowest popularity, and yet he chose that to be his point to go ahead and announce his election. And that's typical Trump. When things are getting down, you go ahead and double down. So that's his style, and to his credit, that's worked for most of his career. We'll see if it continues to work.
It's really interesting. I think that point that you bring up, Tim. I remember kind of the Freedom Caucus or the Freedom Party. I think back, and I just remember this criticism that they had of candidates like John McCain and Mitt Romney, saying they're not conservative enough. We need somebody that's even more right. And then obviously how many people were running that primary? Like 20 something, right? That led to Trump. Like, well, they got it. Like they got the most, conservative candidate that they could, and then he won. But now it feels like you've got this split, and especially after these election results, right? That you still kind of have that, I guess, what's the solid, kind of red meat loving Republican. Like, I don't think of it as traditional Republican. It's kind of like the new Republican Trump base. But then, at some point, you got to take a look at presidential elections and go, like, it's not your base that's going to win. Your map for the House showed it really well that Republicans are always going to do well in the less populous area, the rural parts of the country. There's just these pockets of density that are really going to always kind of indicate the swing states. And it's just these few undecided voters in those swing states that are going to determine the presidential election. And so, for a Republican, I think it'd be really hard to, like, how can we get those swing votes, but then keep feeding meat to the base so that we don't erode anything or lose in a primary. It's got to be a really tough situation for him to be in, it feels like.
Yeah, all excellent points. Let me unpack a few of them. First of all, I didn't see Trump as the most conservative Republican in 16. Probably Ted Cruz was the most conservative Republican that was still there in the race. But Trump was the most combative and the most spirited and the most in-your-face Republican. And I think his style points actually were winning the day for him, quite frankly, among some voters who were tired of Republicans who were being too diplomatic and trying to think about working with the other side, for example. With respect to the base, our system is set up with primaries, so we select our nominees, and that system will drive the base always on both sides. By the way, not a Republican problem at all.
Yeah.
Since primaries, at least in today's system, select the nominees, the key thing is winning the primary. And as Jamie Herrera Butler found out, if you can't keep your base happy because of some perceived sin, her case voting courageously to impeach Trump was her death knell. She could not survive because the primary voters who were supporting Trump were anxious to cast her out. Same thing in District 4, Dan Newhouse. And he was able to fight back, and to his credit, he has been reelected. There were 10 Republicans who had the courage to vote to impeach Trump. Only 2 have survived, and 1 is still hanging on by a thread in California. I think he'll probably win, but that's not a good batting average. Only 2 of 10 survived.
Yeah.
So I told you that the base politics here are still very relevant. And to be fair about this, on the Democratic side, same issue. The very strong liberal base of the Democratic Party drives that party as well, particularly in picking primary candidates. For a member of Congress, the fighting was, oh, we'll primary you. And we use the word now as a verb, we'll primary you. And so that happens. And on both sides, if you believe you could be primaried, that influences your decision-making about where you're going to focus your time and how you're going to vote. If you're going to avoid a primary and that kind of fight, then you might take some votes that you're uncomfortable taking just to kind of keep the base happy. So short answer is, as long as our system is set up with primaries, where we have primaries select our nominees and is party driven, I think base politics will be very, very relevant. When we've had situations where independents or those that are not party driven have tried to influence the process, it's not worked. We've yet to elect an independent, at least nationwide. There are a few examples of independents being elected to the Congress. But from a national perspective and a statewide perspective, it's very, very unusual that independents really can carry the day. They're often just spoilers, quite frankly, toward the end. So our country right now is set up on parties, two dominant parties, and that leads into base politics. And I don't have an answer for that until we change our primary process or until voters will reward candidates who are prepared to buck their party and do what's the common good, if you will, like what Dan Newhouse did. And if voters are prepared to reward someone for doing that, and not just independent voters, but even Republican voters or party voters, people in their own party, then I think you'll have fewer courageous moves because the base still drives their decisions.
It's good. I'll just, and I had a chance to read it a while ago, but, you know, President Kennedy wrote a book about that same point, right? Called Profiles in Courage. And I think it's very telling. And I totally agree with you that our own Dan Newhouse definitely followed that lead.
Having said that, just to be fair about this, I mean, he barely hung on, and you know, but for the fact we had the Trump vote split in the District 4, he survived. Jamie did not. She had one primary candidate, maybe one and a half candidates that were taking that Trump vote, and she did not survive. So it's meaningful, it's important. So you have to figure out how you balance this. And I appreciate the courage and the integrity, but we also have to realize the practicality of it all. I think fundamentally the country's divided and people on both sides have very strong views, they're passionate. I think our media helps create that division to some extent, and we just have to kind of find a way to make an adjustment. Voters who are prepared to break from the traditional lines and think about, we're going to reward someone for being courageous, those voters, they can stand up and become a majority and be passionate about it. That can change the dynamic and decision-making that occurs right now in politics.
Yeah, it's a great point. We've got about 6 minutes left. Let's shift into maybe some of the what we can look forward to as far as federal programs and the impact on the Tri-Cities. We've got a great question from Kevin Smith, and he asked, Tim, what's your sense of future support for small modular reactors and you know, the potential for SMRs at the Hanford site?
I'm very bullish. SMRs in general. I mean, that's one area where there is bipartisan support right now in the Congress. McMorris Rodgers, Kathy has already said it's going to be a party for her in energy and commerce, but she knows this one has got support. Democrats like nuclear, they like advanced nuclear. They see nuclear as being key for climate. And these, I mean, there's a few who do not. I think the majority now of Democrats who are climate focused understand that you can't get there unless you have nuclear as a carbon-free baseload. And doing SMRs, advanced technology, advanced vision, I think is a big part of the future. So I'm very bullish on SMRs plus microreactors, and certainly Hanford is a great place to do it, given the nuclear know-how of the area. The need to have new power for our region as well. I think all of that suggests that our region is very well positioned to be leaders on the SMR/microreactor future.
Yeah, I might just add too that I think with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, now there's been, the federal government has invested billions of dollars into both supporting the existing fleet as well as, supporting this next generation of advanced reactors, past a low enriched uranium fuel production. And so I think it has been one of the few areas on broad kind of energy and climate policy where there's been wholesale support from both sides. And I would also echo what you said, Tim. I think it's, I'm very optimistic about where there's opportunities for us as a community to do nuclear related work. And I know Energy Northwest is really excited about some of those opportunities as well. So hopefully there will be a lot more good news to come here soon.
Yeah, it's great and very well said, David. I think will the split between the House and Senate offer any challenges in Department of Energy's new Office of Clean Energy demonstration to get the money out? I know, we've talked about it before. It's challenged. They've got a lot of money to distribute that's going to spur a lot of job creation and really advances in clean energy sector. Like, is there any changes in Congress that would affect their ability to get those dollars out, Tim, or do you see that those will just continue going as they have, which is, we're, to David's point, we're very bullish for the Tri-Cities that, feel like we're pretty well positioned for some of those dollars to come locally.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the money has already been fully appropriated, so that's there in the bank. It's simply a question of execution. But where it's relevant, though, in terms of the House flip in particular, is the investigations issue. I think folks in DOE all have the Solyndra concern, and they're being very careful to vet everything. And we don't want to be the ones who put out a bid or make an award. It comes back to bite us because it gets investigated and it's found out to be a bad deal. Some fraud or some financial issues, whatever. And so that actually, I've already seen it, quite frankly. You see it more now with Republicans in the House anxious to find the next Solyndra. That's going to temper, I think, the decision-making made by folks at DOE who are putting out the funding for new clean technology. I think we had this was interesting technology. It's very innovative, but if I put it out, will I get beat up? And they'll go one extra step in doing due diligence to make sure that that the financials work. But it's not simply going to be uneconomical or result in lack of the cost issues to line up properly. So that itself may stifle innovation a little bit. You probably have less risk, less go for the big win, if you will, and a bit more conservative, if you will, is what they put out. That they're going to defend it, which might be healthy in some respects, but it also might, in some respects, minimize the deep throw, if you will. Instead, they're going to go for the short passes that are more reliable and have less chance for criticism, but perhaps the payoff won't be quite as significant.
So we're down to like 1 minute now, but I know last time, when we were together in DC earlier this year, Tim, you talked about some of the work that you personally are doing for K&L Gates on some fusion companies. You want to give a plug for fusion, and do you think there's any chance we would be able to build fusion companies in the future in the Tri-Cities?
Yeah, well, thank you for the chance to do so. Yeah, I'm very bullish on fusion as well. I was a staffer back in the 80s working on fusion issues, and of course the line was fusion is 30 years away, it always will be. But fusion is for real now, and it's being driven by entrepreneurial spirit. We have $5 billion now invested in 30 companies nationwide that are doing fusion research, 4 in Washington State, by the way. And there's big money right now coming in from private capital for doing fusion. So I think it's a big answer. I hope the Tri-Cities can step in because of our support with the National Laboratory and just the nuclear know-how we have. We can also be a player, I think, in doing fusion. Fusion is, as you know, is the opposite of fission. You actually create energy by fusing 2 light elements, whereas fission, you split 2 heavy elements. And fusion has an advantage in terms of not having any long-lived nuclear waste, and there's sort of no meltdown risk. And so from a public perception standpoint, it's very advantageous. Plus, the fuel is just water. The fuel is almost free. So lots of advantages. We're not quite there yet. We still require a few more years in doing research, but it's been thought of for years and years as the nirvana for nuclear because it's 100% clean, it's inexhaustible, really no risk, no safety issues, and it's all base load. So and it's very, very compact, dense power. So it has a lot of advantages. It's not going to be a panacea. It needs to be paired up with renewables and also advanced fission, in my opinion. But it's a big part of the solution, it seems to me, for our clean energy future. And I hope the Tri-Cities can jump in the game, because I think it's coming and provides opportunities for our region.
Yep. No, we're with you on that. And thanks for giving us kind of that primer on fusion. We'll have to talk more about it in future. We'll have you back for sure. But Tim, thanks for joining us today. It's always good to see you. Thanks for kind of being our kickoff. I'm bringing Coffee with Karl back. David, great job as always. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for more announcements about Coffee with Karl. We're working on some future webinars that we'll have coming up before the end of the year. So thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Tim.